Greetings, 2%ers. So I've got a good diagnostic video for you. I hope we're going to change it up a little bit and do a real-time diagnosis on a no crank, no start that's due to be towed in here any minute. In a previous video called No Start Diagnosis using the FASTTEC method, I go through every single variable possible for a cranking or non-cranking no start. That's the video you're going to want to watch if you're on this video because you're trying to diagnose a no start for yourself. If, however, you're familiar with that material already with the FASTTEC procedure that I'm going to use, then I'm just going to go through that procedure without really explaining the fundamentals and the basics and just assume that you have that background, and we're just going to follow my thought process through this. All right, so we got 2003 Ford Focus. Owner states that she was driving the vehicle, making a turn, the car completely cut out, never started again. She had the car towed to her house where a neighbor went to town on it, replacing, well, do I have to tell you what the first two things he replaced were? Of course, plugs and wires. Also replaced ignition coil. There's a whole box of fuses in here and a bunch of fuses on the floor, apparently changing a bunch of fuses. He replaced something else. I can't remember what she said, but basically after several $100s, somehow she got hold of me and we're going to figure out what's going on here. So obviously the first thing I want to do, duplicate the problem. Let's start the car, and then while starting the car, I'm going to cheat a little bit and I'm going to use my FASTTEC analysis, just like I said I would do in the previous video. That would be fuel, air, spark, timing with the ignition, timing with the cam crank, exhaust and compression. And just from the cranking, I'm going to triage my FASTTEC to see which ones are most likely and which ones can be eliminated. So let's give it a try. All right, we've got a dead battery, so I've got to charge this up. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and set up a battery charger here. One thing I will tell you, whenever I go out in the field and I do a no start diagnosis, I always bring a battery charger or jumper cables with me, because you got to remember, on a no start, the car's been cranking and cranking and cranking and cranking and cranking and cranking. It's very, very common to find that when you get there, the battery's weak or dead. So we'll go ahead and charge this up and then we'll see what happens. Okay, we should have enough that I can try it. All right, just from that cranking test, using my FASTTEC analysis, I already can eliminate some variables. So because the compressions sound very good and even, compression is to the bottom of the list. I doubt there's a compression problem. Because there's not a compression problem, that means that air has to be entering the cylinder. You can't have compression without air in the cylinder, and there must be exhaust flow. So it's very, very unlikely that compression, air, or exhaust are going to be likely. I haven't totally ruled them out, but they move to the bottom of the triage, and fuel, air, spark, and timing would be much more higher priorities. Now, normally I go for spark first. I probably will also do that because it seems that this guy was chasing spark before me with the plugs, wires, ignition coil. Then again, maybe that's all he knew, but normally spark is the easiest. But also I'm going to do one more thing here just to see if we can maybe get a direction with the fuel and where we're going to place that on our triage. Okay, to test for fuel, I'm going to see if I can hear a key on, engine off prime from the fuel pump. And I don't hear anything at all. There's a little bit of a whine from the front of the vehicle, I believe from the electronics, but I don't hear anything at the tank. Now, not all vehicles have a key on, engine off, fuel pump prime. I'm not 100% sure about that on this car. Because I'm not 100% sure, I think we're going to go with spark first and try to eliminate that. All right, well, there are definitely brand new plugs, wires, and a brand new ignition coil there. So, you know what? And as long as I've been doing this, never once have I received a car that somebody else has worked on before me and it didn't have plugs and wires on it. So this is nothing new for me. All the less I have to rule out. But let's go ahead and see if we got spark. Well, as we can clearly see, spark is not the problem with this car. So, as usual, the woman spent $200 or so that she absolutely didn't need to. Just that simple test would have saved all of those parts trying to chase after spark. So, what can you do? But at this point, I think it goes without saying, if you're anything like me, and my apologies if you are, fuel just jumped to the very top of the list. So what we're going to do is, let me see if we've got a well, yeah, it doesn't look like we are going to have a Schrader valve here. Let me just double check. Yeah, and most definitely there is not a Schrader valve on here, so hooking up fuel pressure is a little more challenging. Normally, of course, I would do that just for the educational purposes. In this video, we are going for speed of diagnosis, so I'm just going to confirm 100% if we've got a fuel problem the fast way. So my quick and dirty strategy here is going to be to just put a little starter fluid or something right down the throttle body, and we'll see if the car fires up then. All right, well, there you have it. If I wasn't filming, in probably 2 minutes, I would have had a diagnosis that there is no fuel getting to this engine. Now, of course, it doesn't mean we know why that's the case, but we have definitive direction in just 2 minutes with some very simple basic tests. Obviously, I'm kind of thinking fuel pump right now, so we're going to have to go ahead and make sure whether we've got fuel pressure at the rail or whether we've got the injectors not firing, but for whatever reason, we have 100% confirmation there is no fuel delivery in this engine. We can also rule out every other variable in the FASTTEC procedure because the car ran perfectly fine. So we know that there's good timing with the cam and crank. We know there's good ignition timing. We've obviously got spark. We've already seen that. So the only thing we've got to worry about is fuel. So at this point, given the fact that there seems to be no activity from fuel pump and we've got the fuse block cover door taken off and an owner's manual on the floor, I just want to check the fuses and see what this guy before me was going after. So actually the owner's manual's bookmarked with a fuse at 15 amps, which, let's see, fuel pump is a 15 amp fuse in position 12. But, well, that's definitely not the right fuse block. So yeah, this is going to be up in the power box in the front of the vehicle. So let's just go check that fuse real quick. Okay, so you can clearly see the fuse right there. You can even see that it's perfectly intact. Just to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and test with a meter, look for continuity, and there is. So the fuse is not the problem, so I think we probably ought to go for fuel pressure next. And it actually just occurred to me, I forgot already, there's no Schrader valve on this thing. So it would actually take me longer to rig up some type of fuel pressure test than it would to do some other tests. One thing I could do is check for voltage from fuel injector, make sure the injector's firing. Obviously, we're making the quickest diagnosis possible here. It is unlikely the injectors are not firing. It's more likely to be a fuel pump. So I'm going to go in that direction, and I think what I'm going to do is try to manually energize the fuel pump through the relay box, which is here, and we'll just leave that on. There's a fuel pump right there. It's this relay right here. So what I'm going to do is pull this relay and let's take a look. Okay, and as you can see, I'm lucky this relay has a map on it, so this really helps my testing. Now, if you're not familiar with relays, you're going to want to see my previous video, Diagnosis and Understanding Relays and Relayed Control, and it will explain all the tests in detail that I'm doing. So if you don't know how I know what I'm going to poke around at on this relay and in the car, you're going to want to watch this video first because I'm not going to go over it. I'm going to assume that you've done your homework. So what I can tell by looking at this is positions 1 and 2 are going to be, I can see, you won't be able to see it in the camera, but I've got positions 1 and 2 on these terminals. That's my control side. And then it looks like when control voltage is added to the solenoid, we are going to move the switch to position 5. Position 5 is right in the center, so that should be easy to find, not just on the relay, but in the car. I think as long as I've got this out, and I'm going to have to, you can do this with jumper wires. I'm going to make it easy using my power probe. I'm just going to test this relay real quick, and then we're going to try to manually energize the pump using the port for the relay in the vehicle. And all this is, it's just a negative and positive jumper wire with a switch that I can do instead of having live hot all the time like a real pair of jumper wires. So we're going to look for continuity on the load side, and then we're just going to apply voltage to the control, and when the relay clicks, all right, let's make sure nothing's going to ground out here. Okay, there we go. And now when the relay clicks, we should see continuity. And we do, so we know that the relay works. So let's go into the relay box in the car. I want to go ahead and put 12 volts directly to the fuel pump, see if I can get it to energize. And normally I would have an extensive series of warnings not to do this unless you know exactly what you're doing so you don't fry your PCM or whatever. But it turns out so far 2 people who have watched my videos have fried their PCM, and one even destroyed his engine despite my multiple warnings in each of those videos not to do what I'm doing unless you're absolutely certain what you're doing, and they just ignored that, so I'm not even going to bother. But what I want to do is go ahead, and normally I would jumper this with like a paper clip, but since I had my power probe handy, let's make sure I've got contact. And we're going to go to this position 5, which basically this acts as closing the switch and putting power. Nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. So this helps narrow down our situation. Okay, there's several ways to do this. I am going to opt to use my voltmeter, and we are going to hook it up to the control side right now. Okay, let me go ahead and turn the key on and see that we get voltage there. Okay, we can see we've got voltage there because I'm looking at both power and ground. I know that they have to work. So we've got control to the relay. All right, and sorry for the glare on the meter if there was some there, but got that adjusted a little better. So let's see, we now need to test the load side. So I'm going to go ahead and look at a reminder on my relay map here, and it looks like it's going to default to an off position, of course, but position number 5 would be the on position when the solenoid is active. My bet is this is going to be a ground side control, so let's put the ground onto number 5, and my bet is that this is going to be hot at all times here, and we can see that it is. So this confirms that our load side has good integrity, and we've got voltage power to it. So we've got the relay working, we've got the control and load side working. So basically this is really adding up to a fuel pump. So we're definitely going to have to go after this fuel pump next. Now, that isn't to say that the fuel pump is bad. There are other possibilities, but again, because we're making the fastest direct diagnosis, we need to look at what our possibilities are and go for the best one. Okay, so we're going to obviously go and test the fuel pump directly. We're not going to replace the fuel pump based on this, although the evidence is pretty strong, but it's not 100% scientifically conclusive. Now, that said, I'm going to comment on that. There are actually 4 possibilities that explain our situation based on the evidence we've gathered so far. One of them would be, of course, a bad fuel pump. The other one, I'm not totally sure, but I'd have to look at a wiring diagram, but an inertia safety shutoff switch, like for an accident to shut off the fuel pump. The other possibility would be a broken wire, of course, to the fuel pump, so we can read it at the fuse box, but there is a lack of integrity on the way to the fuel pump. Very unlikely, admitted. And then the other possibility would, of course, be an extreme voltage drop to the point that the fuel pump doesn't even turn at all. Again, very, very unlikely. So the thing I wanted to point out is that, and again, I apologize because I'm speaking on behalf of professional technicians here, and I am not a technician or a mechanic, but this is one where I believe that these guys should get some leeway. The thing is that if I were an hourly rate technician at this point, based on the evidence I have right now, I would make a call that this car needs a fuel pump without directly 100% being sure by testing the fuel pump. My only other alternative is to either, I don't know if I've got to drop the tank to get to the pump on this car or remove the back seat, but the amount of effort required now to get that extra 5% confirmation at this point, to be honest with you, I can easily see where as a technician it's a good call based on your working environment and your pay, sort of incentives to make a call like that. So I just wanted to point out, you got to give them guys some leeway. If this doesn't turn out to be a fuel pump, I'm going to be absolutely shocked, but we will check for sure. And I'm going to go ahead and hook up a fuel pressure gauge. Obviously, I'd normally be a lot more careful doing this, but we know that we're not going to get fuel, and you can see there's no fuel coming out of there at all. Okay, that should show up. Let me go ahead and just crank this engine over and confirm there's no fuel pressure. Okay, as you can see, the gauge didn't even budge. So when we get this fixed and we start applying voltage directly to the fuel pump, and more likely after I replace it with a new one, we'll be able to get some quantitative measurement. I also want to make sure that the fuel pressure is within spec after I finish the fuel pump anyway. So it is actually a good thing to put this pressure gauge on regardless. Well, I did my research, and it turns out there's no access panel under the back seat like many Fords have. And that's just as well, because there's actually a child seat in the back seat of this car. Lord knows I'd never figure out how to remove that thing, thank God. But I took a look under the car, and it turns out that this is probably the easiest fuel tank drop of any vehicle I've ever seen. So if I have to drop the tank, this is the one you want to do it on. And what I'm going to do is, I think I've got everything in this shot. These undercar shots are extremely difficult, I must say. And I've got a wiring diagram here, and according to the diagram, we are going to want to probe this green and orange wire at the end here, and then here's a ground. All right, and then what we're going to do is just back probing this harness. I'm going to turn the key on, and obviously if we get power here during the fuel pump prime or during a cranking, that's going to be pretty damning evidence we need a fuel pump, and then we'll just put 12 volts to this, which I guess I could do, but I just want to confirm we've got power here. So let me go ahead and turn the key on, and let's see if we get voltage. Okay, that pretty much does that. All right, so I'm going to do one last final test here, and let's leave those probes in there. So we could do voltage drop test, but again, we're going for speed here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put 12 volts right to this pump. And let me make sure, just in case this thing runs, which it won't, but we don't get any fuel around here. And I've drained the tank anyway. But let's go ahead and put 12 volts and listen for the fuel pump. And absolutely nothing at all. So there is 100% confirmation. There is no question about it. This car needs a fuel pump. So let me go ahead and replace the fuel pump, and then we'll see if it starts up. All right, we're gonna go ahead and bench test this thing, but what I wanted to do is just kind of remind you guys, don't just replace the pump. I'm always trying to think upstream of a problem. What could have caused this pump to fail? So one of the things I always do, I check the restrainer sock, see if there's any material on there. I clean out the tank very well, remove any kind of sediment or anything. And I also check the inside lining on these plastic tanks especially, make sure the lining isn't peeling. If you guys are following the channel, you probably remember the Jeep where I diagnosed a fuel pump, and the Jeep needed a fuel pump every year for like 3 years. Stuff like that is exactly what can cause these frequent fuel pump failures, because they strain the pump, because they clog it. And then another really important thing, anytime I do a fuel pump, I always replace with a new fuel filter. Again, a clogged fuel filter makes the pump have to work harder, more likely to have to replace it because of it being strained. So those are just some tips to make sure that you only do this job once every very, very long time. All right, let's go ahead and bench test this thing. Obviously, these are going to be our 2 power wires. There we go. And let's see here. And let's see, well, that's not going to work. There's not enough room, so let's just go ahead and back probe these. There we go. And then all this is going to do is, I remember on the very first video I did this, and you couldn't even see it because of the horrible resolution on my camera. But it turned out the pump was actually okay. The wiring was just bad between the connector and the pump inside the tank. And yeah, that motor is fried. It is not doing anything. So in this case, it definitely is the motor that's bad. So this thing new fuel pump will do it. All right, and here's our new fuel pump. Now, one little word of advice, just test these very briefly. Do not run these for any length of time to test them when they're new. They need the fuel as kind of a lubricant and for cooling. So we're just gonna test this real quick just to make sure that this new pump is good. Okay, hopefully you can hear that. So that is going to fix this car. Let's put this back in and then we'll just start it up to close out the video. All right, a little unexpected complication. It turns out that that fuel pump is not the right one for this car. It is very, very slightly different on the slot patterns, so it doesn't line up to lock into the fuel tank. And don't even say that you noticed that. But the problem is that unless I get one from a dealer for about $500 or so, I'm not going to be able to get one for about 5 days because none of the parts stores carry it in stock. So we're gonna go ahead and hang on to this thing until next weekend and I'll finish the job up. But I'm gonna go ahead and just end the video here. The point, of course, is the diagnosis, and the diagnosis was 100% conclusive. So we're done here, and barring any amazingly unforeseen circumstances, that'll be the end of this video. So thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful.